Who really holds the power in Germany? It's certainly not the ordinary people who go to work and build cars. After that phone call, I barely slept. And then I thought, how am I going to fight back? Everything is being done to keep people from meeting each other. And that leads straight to disaster. It's obviously all planned. They want us to have no connection with Russians at all. That way, it's easier to kill them.
Are campaigns being staged here against those who want to get to the bottom of the truth? Against the current, about the person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Wir zeigen Ihnen
Hello and welcome to Against the Current. We present viewpoints and perspectives that the propaganda media choose to hide. Ulrich Heyden is a German war correspondent. He's been living in Moscow since 1992. He knows the war zone in Ukraine very well. He's traveled through the region many times and spoken with countless people. He's able to put things to the test of reality. And that reality doesn't match what our so-called quality media spread as propaganda. He's written a book about his life and his memories. It's called My Path to Russia, Experiences and Memories of a Reporter. Welcome, Ulrich Heyden. Thank you for the invitation, Patrick. Mr. Heyden, the Hamburg Savings Bank has closed your account. Why?
Why? It all started with a phone call on March 12th. They said there were these Russia sanctions and asked if I might want to move back to Hamburg. Then they wouldn't have to close my account. I said, that's not possible. You can't live abroad as a German and still have a residence in Germany. Then there was silence on the line. And what else did he say? Oh, right. He also said, yeah, our savings bank is under pressure from BaFin, the Financial Supervisory Authority.
The Federal Financial Supervisory Authority.
So basically, he presented himself or that employee as if they were acting under external pressure. And it's also possible that this is actually the case.
And BaFin is a federal agency.
Well, I didn't even know about this BaFin before, so I looked it up, and to my shock, I found out it's a federal agency that reports directly to the finance minister. So of course, that makes it a political matter. Then, the very next day, the termination notice arrived. And I think it said something like, they were reviewing and ending business relationships with all customers in Russia. That's the wording they used. But they didn't accuse me of anything. I mean, I've had that account since 1990. That's 34 years. So that's really strange. And I've never failed to repay a loan or anything like that, because I've always been in the black. Financially, I was doing just fine, you could say. There were absolutely no complaints, nothing at all. It was really just this suspicion or this hint that maybe I was now one of those people they wanted to cut off, so to speak. I mean, I'd been following closely what they did to you, basically a professional ban. And then Dogru, the journalist in Berlin, and also Alina Lipp and Thomas Roper. I mean, luckily, I'm not really afraid yet. Or well, of course, I do feel a bit of fear, because these days, you just never know what might happen to you. So, if I travel to Germany now, I'm wondering if there's still something waiting for me there. Because I mean, of course I'd love to go to Germany, perform, talk with people, visit friends, and so on. But that's all getting harder and harder for me. For one thing, I need money, and now I basically have to set up a new bank account, which is really difficult, because with these online banks, you verify your identity on the internet using your passport. And in my passport, it's not just the first page that matters, but also the second one, and that one says, issued in Moscow by a German consulate. What I've noticed, especially with German and other online banks, is that they tend to react almost allergic and then just stop responding. So really, the only option left for me is the Eurasian region. But even that's difficult, because which online outlet? Well, I write for online media like Nachdenkseiten, Overtone Magazine, and Junge Welt. Who among them has the time to deal with complicated transfers where you have to fill out pages of forms? People in Germany are used to just typing in an IBAN number, and it takes maybe 40 seconds. For me, it turns into an hour-long process. And of course, that's discouraging. I mean, who knows?
Ich meine, wer weiß. Ich habe denn also in der Nacht nach diesem Anruf habe ich
So that night after the phone call, I barely slept. And then I started thinking, how am I going to defend myself? That's when I remembered my great-uncle, my grandmother's brother. Her maiden name was von Schwerin, and her brother was Ulrich Wilhelm Count Schwerin von Schwanenfeld. So I decided to include him in my defense strategy. I wrote a letter to Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the federal president, and I told him, well, I'm 71 now, and what am I supposed to say to my great-uncle when I meet him in heaven? What would he say to me? That's what I wrote in my open letter to Frank-Walter Steinmeier.
Do you want to read a part of the letter out loud?
Ja, okay. Also,
Yeah, okay. So, what should I say to my great-uncle Ulrich Wilhelm Graf Schwerin von Schwanenfeld when I meet him in heaven? I have to say, my parents gave me the first names Ulrich Wilhelm after him. He was executed in September 1944 in Berlin-Plötzensee, murdered with a wire noose for resisting the Hitler regime. I carry his name in his honor. What would my great-uncle say? He'd say that there was murder and terror against people who thought differently, even back in the Nazi era, and that he could never have imagined something like that happening again in Germany. I also wrote in the letter that I'm not aware of any other German journalists in Moscow having these kinds of problems. I mean, if sanctions are the reason being given in my case, then that should actually affect all the other German journalists in Moscow who supposedly have trouble transferring money to Russia. But as far as I know, that's not the case.
nach Russland aber das ist nichts davon ist bekannt, ne? Also
Kann man.
Can we say, using your example, that the federal government is using BaFin, savings banks, and financial institutions to pressure or even punish those who don't go along with its propaganda and its course of war?
Die ihrer Propaganda und ihrem Kriegskurs nicht folgen.
auf jeden Fall. Ich meine, das ist doch
Absolutely. I mean, when I go online, I find plenty of cases of professors whose accounts have been closed. As far as I know, BaFin was created during the financial crisis to monitor the kinds of instabilities that existed in the financial markets. But now, it's basically being used as a tool of repression. To me, that's obvious.
als Repressionsinstrument eingesetzt ist für mich offensichtlich.
Is that a strategy of indirect censorship?
Natürlich.
Of course.
Damit wäre das
That would be unconstitutional, a violation of the Basic Law. Because we know what Article 5 of the Basic Law says, there shall be no censorship.
Zensur findet nicht statt.
Ja, also ganz klar. Ich habe auch mit vielen Anwälten
Yes,
gesprochen, also
absolutely.
Anwälte waren bereit,
Very clear.
waren sogar
I also talked to a lot of lawyers. Several of them were ready, actually eager to defend me. I just didn't have the money on hand to hire them.
gesagt, ja,
One lawyer told me, you at least have to file an objection and say you haven't found another bank yet. That means it's a termination at an unreasonable time. And HASPA actually responded to that. They postponed the termination by 2 months until the end of June. And I think the really bad part about all this is that it's not just us. Well, I even hesitated. I was afraid to make it public at first.
Ich hatte sogar Angst, die Überlegung, wenn ich das jetzt öffentlich mache. Und es wurde wirklich, ich wurde von sehr vielen.
And it really happened. I was contacted by a lot of newspapers and media outlets. The Berliner Zeitung, Neues Deutschland, even the Left Party's local chapter in Altona, wrote a resolution that mentioned my name along with Dogru's. So it clearly had a strong emotional impact. I could tell that from the media reactions. But of course, it's a double-edged situation. On one hand, you feel solidarity and compassion. On the other hand, there's also fear. It's not openly talked about, but it's definitely there. If that fear didn't exist, people would be showing up in huge numbers, going to the savings banks, and protesting.
Sparkassen aufsuchen und protestieren. In meinem Fall war es immerhin, das fand ich auch sehr toll, also die
In my
Friedensinitiative
case,
Altona
it was
Frida.
actually really great. The peace initiative Altona Frida organized a rally on the 22nd, just a couple of weeks ago, in front of the HASPA headquarters in Hamburg on Domtor Street. They gave their speeches there. And then I read a report about it, which I found pretty strange. A photographer named Christian Witt had been watching the whole thing and wrote an article about it. Apparently, some bodyguards came out and looked at the group with suspicion. One of them said something like, "Well, for that kind of hate, you're just bodyguards. That's all you are." There were about 50 people there, and the atmosphere was quite negative. But that's really the problem, this fear that's spreading across Germany because of things like that. It leads to paralysis, and we have to find a way to break through that paralysis.
Wie wir diese Lähmung durchbrechen können.
Werden Leute wie du,
Are people like you, children and grandchildren of anti-fascist resistance fighters who were executed, being subjected to government reprisals to spread fear and push the German population into a new war with Russia?
in einen neuen Krieg mit Russland hineinzutreiben?
Ja, leider ist es so.
Yes, unfortunately, that's how it is. I mean, I've noticed it since 2014. Fear is being created. Of course, when a plane crashes or gets shot down, like MH17, I have a circle of friends connected to that.
Freundeskreis sind, also solche.
Das war der Absturz, glaube 2000.
That was the crash, I think it was in 2015, of a passenger plane over the war zone in the Donbass, which was hit by a missile.
Die getroffen wurden.
Forces in the Donbass, separatist forces are being blamed.
Werden Kräfte,
But the case hasn't been fully clarified yet.
separatistische Kräfte, 100%ig aufgeklärt ist der Fall allerdings nicht.
Mhm. Ja, ich meine, das.
Yeah, I mean, I just picked that up on an emotional level. People who normally aren't political suddenly became really anxious. It's probably a kind of reflex, not just from TV or movies, but maybe even from family history. The Second World War wasn't that long ago, and that brings up some deep-seated feelings, but those feelings often don't lead to clear thinking, to really analyzing who's the aggressor, who started it. Instead, people get swept up in a mass mood that's being created by the German media. And that mood is directed against one country, Russia. All the other possible parties who might have an interest in escalating things aren't even being considered.
An einer Zuspitzung, die werden ja gar nicht in Betracht gezogen. Ne? Also eine ganz nüchterne Analyse von.
A really sober analysis of conflicts hasn't been done at all since 2014. And the other side never gets a voice anymore. For example, when I was working as a journalist in Moscow for serious German outlets, the Rheinischer Merkur, the Sächsische Zeitung, I was always asked, could you please include the Russian position on this or that? On the federal election, on the climate summit, on some global disaster being discussed. The Russian point of view was always part of the story. But since 2014, that's no longer the case. At the same time, ground troops were being sent out against people who thought differently, people like me. On Facebook, for instance, I wrote about the fire at the trade union building in Odessa and even made a film about it, because it affected me so deeply.
Der Brand im Gewerkschaftshaus am 2. Mai.
The fire at the trade union building in Odessa on May 2nd, 2014, which was started by Ukrainian neo-Nazis and claimed the lives of nearly 50 people.
Fast 50 Menschen ums Leben gekommen sind.
Ja, ich bin da spontan hingefahren.
I went there on the spur of the moment. I had basically already been let go from the Sächsische Zeitung and felt free. Finally, I could really take on a topic myself. I noticed that the German media were afraid of this subject.
Medien haben Angst vor diesem Thema.
What changed in 2014?
Verändert.
Ja, das also zum Beispiel ich im Facebook.
Yeah, for example, I was massively attacked on Facebook by hordes of so-called Ukraine supporters with the worst kinds of insults. Whenever I wrote about that fire, they accused me of trying to write a war into existence. But all I did was point out that 48 people burned to death or had to jump out of windows. And when they hit the ground, they were beaten to death. That really shocked me. So I thought, fine, I'll just leave them there with their comments, accusing me of all sorts of terrible things. And at some point, well, it took about half a year, I finally started just deleting or blocking them.
Einfach zu löschen. Oder zu blockieren, ne? Aber ich meine, das ist, dann habe
But I
ich
mean,
am
that's.
Freitag hatte ich auch
Then I
einen
also
Blog
had a
auf der
blog with
Webseite
Der Freitag, the weekly newspaper,
Da hat es
where I
eine Gruppe
worked as a
von 4
writer.
Leuten,
And there was this group of
die ist
about
auch
4 people
in die
who really
Offensive
went on the
gegangen, haben dann
offensive.
praktisch jeden Beitrag
Practically
ungefähr
every
20
time I
Minuten,
posted
nachdem ich das
something,
gepostet
about
hatte,
20 minutes later,
oft eben
they'd jump in.
das Ukraine-Thema
I often brought up
mich
the
da,
topic of Ukraine
also
because I felt I
sehr
knew the
fühlte
subject
und
well
weil ich
and had
offen
spent a
war.
lot of time there.
Und
And this group included,
das
among
war eine
others,
Gruppe,
the
da
founder
war
of a
einmal
Ukrainian
der Gründer eines
association in
ukrainischen
Hamburg.
Vereins in Hamburg,
So
war
real
dabei.
hardcore
Also
Ukraine
richtige
supporters,
Hardcore
people who had
Ukraine
actually been
Unterstützer,
there,
die
and they tried to tell me I had no right to write about Ukraine, that only they could because they'd been there. And I said, well, I've been traveling to Ukraine since 1992.
Und dann sagte ich, ja, ich bin doch schon seit 1992 bereise ich schon die Ukraine. Habe da auch Artikel und überall veröffentlicht und ja, das zählt
I had
jetzt nicht,
published
weil es war
articles everywhere too,
die Ukraine unter
but that didn't
ukrainischer
count for
Unterdrückung.
them, because back then it was still Ukraine under Russian influence. So in their view, nothing reasonable could have been reported from there. But after the Maidan, they suddenly saw themselves as the only ones entitled to speak, so to say. Unbelievable methods were used, and the reaction was just incredible. I mean, the reaction from the whole audience was really weak. I didn't feel much support. I often felt, I have to say, kind of, well, you'd think maybe someone from the editorial team, or even just people watching, could have stepped in and said, hey folks, you're going a bit too far here. Let's keep it a bit more objective. But that never happened.
Werden hier
Are campaigns being staged here against those who want to get to the bottom of the truth?
die der Wahrheit auf den Grund gehen wollen?
Ja, also es ist leider so. Ich meine,
Yeah, unfortunately,
bin ja nicht so
that's how it
arrogant,
is.
dass ich sage, ich
I
bin
mean,
der
I'm not
Einzige,
so
der
arrogant as to
Wahrheit
claim I'm the only one who wants to get to the truth. But still, I do say, they don't want the truth. I mean, I grant everyone else the right to have their own opinion, and maybe they even believe they've got the truth. But the very least you should expect in a debate is that both sides can actually speak normally. And that's just not possible anymore. You open your mouth or you turn on your computer and you've already made a mistake.
Das ist mir schon, hat mir schon Fehler gemacht.
Also
Propaganda and censorship go hand in hand.
in Hand.
Ja, und richtige Einschüchterung, ja, also richtige.
Yeah, and real intimidation, I mean, actual insults. That really shook me. And the fact that we're now in a situation where this war machine, Germany wanting so badly to be ready for war, can unfold like this in a country that's really all about work-life balance and enjoying life, that's just shocking. I mean, Germany, where is this going to end? Of course, I also ask myself, did I do something wrong? Did I make good enough use of my time as a correspondent in Moscow to cover the issues that are now so clearly showing up as being underrepresented in the German mindset?
Unterbelichtet sind im deutschen Bewusstsein. Also wie, was weiß ich, die Blockade von Leningrad, die, was weiß
Like,
ich, überhaupt
take the blockade of
gefragt
Leningrad,
wurde,
for
wofür haben
example.
eigentlich die Sowjetsoldaten
Or
damals
just the
gekämpft?
basic
Wurden sie
question,
angetrieben?
what were Soviet soldiers actually fighting for back then?
Geheimdienstoffiziere, die
Were they
damals
driven
hinter
forward by
Russland kämpften,
Chekists,
sind wirklich
by
von
intelligence
Russland
officers standing behind them
ganz
with
banale
guns,
Fragen, die ja
or were
jetzt,
they really fighting for their
wichtig sind,
homeland?
zu verstehen, woher kommt
These are
eigentlich russischer
simple questions,
Patriotismus?
but they're important now if we
Warum
want
sind
to
die Russen
understand
so
where
sehr
Russian
interessiert,
patriotism
wenn
actually
NATO
comes
und
from.
an
Why are
öffentliche
Russians so sensitive
Ukraine
when
geht?
NATO moves closer
Ich
to the
meine,
Russian border through
wir wurden
Ukraine?
praktisch als
I mean, as
Korrespondenten
correspondents, we
uns
basically
wurde
weren't given any
vorgeführt, wie
space for
als wenn
that.
man
Even when it
das
came to
Thema
topics like forced laborers,
Zwangsarbeiter,
Soviet war veterans, or all
sowjetische
those sites of
Kriegsveteranen,
destruction across the Soviet Union.
überhaupt diese ganzen Schauplätze der Vernichtung in der Sowjetunion. Ich meine, das ist doch im Prinzip in Deutschland bis heute nicht
I mean, that's
aufgeklärt.
still not really known well enough in Germany, even today. I'm talking about 27 million dead, half of them civilians. These are real places, real mass graves. And I remember, for example, back in 1995, there was that exhibition by Hannes Heer the historian who searched archives in Belarus for documents showing what German soldiers had experienced and what they had seen. And he actually found evidence proving that German soldiers had witnessed the extermination of the Jews and had taken part in it.
Ja, die Judenvernichtung miterlebt haben, mitgeholfen haben. Das heißt, es ist nicht so, dass nur die SS gemordet.
That means it wasn't just the SS that committed murders, but also regular German soldiers. I mean, the whole topic really stirred up German society. Back in 1995, there were protests against it. My father, for example, said it was all nonsense, that the Wehrmacht exhibition was just meant to make the German army look bad. And that's what a lot of conservative people thought. Well, I think as Germans, we can only be normal human beings if we know our entire history. Of course, that's not easy, and the state has to help with that, and so does the cultural sector. In East Germany, I think they partly managed to accompany that with a kind of cultural reflection. And, I mean, this lack of knowledge about the Second World War, about what exactly happened on the Eastern Front, is one reason why there now seems to be a willingness in Germany to go to war again. And maybe psychologically, it's also that people think, well, my father suffered a lot back then. He was in Siberia. Of course, no one would actually say that out loud, but maybe somewhere deep in the mind there's this thought. Now we'll show the Russians too.
Und das war ja kein Krieg.
And this wasn't just any war. It was a planned, deliberate war of destruction and subjugation.
I mean, this fact too, unfortunately, even the Russians, by the way, they brought up the issue of the planned extermination of the Soviet civilian population, but for years they neglected it. They didn't want to jeopardize the good relations that had developed with Germany after 1991. They had a great deal of respect for the Germans, not fear, but genuine respect. They wanted to preserve peace. And now, in a way, that's coming back to haunt them because they have to start again to investigate and explain what really happened. For example, what was the General Plan Ost? It was a deliberate plan, a goal that said the German army should feed itself only from Soviet territory, which meant that millions of Russians were left with nothing to eat. There was a plan to settle German colonists on large estates, all the way into the Leningrad region, the Ukrainian region, Crimea, and so on. So Germans were supposed to be settled there, and there were different versions of that plan. That's something that was never really discussed properly in Germany, and only now are the Russians starting to talk about it again. Because, I mean, I have to say honestly, I admire the Russians for how restrained they've been. It's really remarkable. But of course, I'm also afraid that at some point this restraint could turn into emotion. Right now, I can still walk through Moscow and say, I'm German. And people even react positively. Oh, German, great. Can we speak German or English? So there are no negative reactions to being German. But I'm afraid that someday that could change. And then, honestly, I don't know what I'd do.
The spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, basically said, the Russians have forgiven, the Germans have forgotten. Would you agree with that?
The Russians have forgiven and the Germans have forgotten. Yes, that's completely true. Yes.
Is there a kind of reversal of guilt happening in Germany? Are some people maybe even a little pleased about the Russian army invading Ukraine, just so they can say, finally the Russians are the ones to blame for something?
Yes, absolutely.
Revenge for Stalingrad.
Yeah.
I know it might sound a bit simplistic, but that's really how it is. I honestly wish Germans could experience what it's like to sit down with a Russian, talk openly about all these issues, and then feel that the Russian actually sees you as a person and sees Germans as people too. They really can't imagine that They often think it's just our leadership stirring things up against Russia. But the idea that Germans themselves might once again come back with weapons in hand, I don't think they can truly picture that yet. The Russians, they're capable of forgiveness. That's really remarkable. I don't even know where that comes from. To forgive after 27 million dead, to forgive but not forget, that's something deeply rooted in the Russian character.
Mit der russischen Art zu tun. Ich weiß es auch nicht.
Russische Historiker haben ja immer mit Blick auf Deutschland.
Russian historians have always talked about our shared history with Germany. But our current foreign minister came out and said, Russia will always remain our enemy. What went wrong in Germany?
Was ist da in Deutschland schiefgelaufen?
Ja, was ist schiefgelaufen? Ab 1991.
Yes, but it went wrong. Starting in 1991, Germany, in my view, maneuvered itself into a kind of winner's position. That means the withdrawal of Soviet troops and the collapse of East Germany were somehow taken as proof that our Western system was the better one, more functional, more modern, more democratic. And basically, nothing positive was acknowledged on the other side, except that they could move closer to us, and apparently wanted to, by copying things, copying laws, adopting certain democratic methods we have in Germany, and so on. But that attitude, a rather arrogant attitude, I'd say, that's the fundamental mistake, one that unfortunately is deeply rooted in West Germany.
Der leider in Westdeutschland ausgeprägt ist, in Ostdeutschland meiner Ansicht nach nicht so, weil die Leute dort.
In Eastern Germany, they don't see it that way, because people there actually saw the Russian soldiers all the time. They saw that he was just an ordinary soldier, maybe poorly dressed, coming from some small village, really just a poor guy. They saw the person behind the uniform. They also saw the monuments that were put up there, honoring the Soviet army, the Army of Liberation. So the kind of socialization and political awareness there was really different. And this arrogance that unfortunately exists in the German mindset, shaped by the media, by misguided political leadership, and to be fair, also by other Western powers like Britain and the United States. This idea that we're somehow something special, with a kind of mission to fulfill, that's really the big mistake.
Mit einem Sendungsbewusstsein, das ist eigentlich der große Fehler.
Bundeskanzler Friedrich Merz.
Chancellor Friedrich Merz said some time ago that Russia has no chance of winning the war in Ukraine. Will Germany, especially the German elite, end up becoming a victim of its own arrogance?
Opfer ihrer eigenen Überheblichkeit?
Ja, also auf jeden Fall hat sie sich völlig verrannt.
Well, she's completely lost her way, no question about it. I mean, she's pursuing a goal that could be deadly for Germany. You can't even rule out the possibility of a nuclear missile hitting Germany. Now, I'm not saying that Russia is going to win the war in Ukraine. This could go on for years. But what's absolutely clear is that this war only brings suffering and death to both Germans and Russians. And those who don't do everything they can to stop it, to start talking, to find some kind of compromise, those are people who, frankly, are practically wishing for Germany's destruction.
Muss man schon fast so sagen, die wollen praktisch den Tod Deutschlands. Und ich meine, was sind das auch für Leute?
And I mean, what kind of people are these, really? What kind of people? None of them have ever lived in Russia, or almost none. None of them speak Russian. They all studied in Washington, or in London, or in some other Western capital. But the entire Eastern region, well, that's where the so-called subhumans live, right? That's not culture. They're not developed.
So, within the German elite, there's Russophobia, and that's a form of racism, right? Am I understanding that correctly?
Das ist richtig.
Ja, genau. Also
Yes, exactly. I mean, I noticed that in the intellectual circles in Germany. They always said, well, even in my own family, you could say, sure, there are good Russians, like this architect or that artist. Those were people from the liberal scene, often just about to move to Germany. But the ordinary Russian, that was always kept at a bit of a distance. People didn't really know. Maybe he was the one who shot at my father or my grandfather, and it was never really talked about. The simple Russian farmer or worker doesn't appear on German television at all.
Russische Bauer oder Arbeiter, der tauchte doch im deutschen Fernsehen gar nicht auf. Es gibt doch massenweise wunderbare Filme. Also,
There are
aus
so many
sowjetischer
wonderful
Zeit.
films from the Soviet era,
Propagandafilme.
and they're
Sehr
absolutely not
hochwertige,
propaganda films.
künstlerische Filme
They're
über
high-quality, artistic movies
das
about
sowjetische
everyday
Alter,
Soviet life,
über
about love,
Liebe,
about all
über
kinds of humorous topics.
irgendwelche
But none of
humoristischen
that
Filme.
ever made it
Es ist
onto
nicht so
German
die Sache im
television.
deutschen
It's all
Fernsehen,
just
es ist doch
Hollywood,
nur
and that's supposed to explain the
Hollywood.
whole world. And I
Und
mean, that's
damit ist schon
that's
wieder
really a kind of
ich meine, das
racism
ist,
and such arrogance. And then people who
das ist
find
schon
Russia
ein Form von
interesting,
Rassismus
who
und
write online with
von
real
Überheblichkeit
enthusiasm,
und
saying
man
things
versucht
like,
irgendwie
I'd love to go to Russia,
die Leute
I'd
in
love to visit
Russland
Red
irgendwie
Square,
interessant
I'd love to go
finden
to a concert in
und
St.
geistig im
Petersburg.
Internet schreiben, ich
Those
möchte
people
gerne
get
Russland
judged
ich
for
möchte
it.
gerne auf den Roten Platz, ich möchte gerne mal in St. Petersburg in ein Konzert gehen. Die werden doch irgendwie schon als so ein bisschen,
They're kind of
sag ich
portrayed,
mal,
as a
gestört,
bit odd,
fast
almost disturbed, even ridiculed, I'd say.
belächelt, sag ich mal.
But really, there's no reason to laugh at
Gab gar
them.
keinen Grund
I mean, the
belächelt. Ich meine,
relationship
die
between
Beziehung
Germany
zwischen
and
Deutschland
Russia
und
was
Russland war
good for hundreds
100
of
Jahre
years.
lang ja gut.
The
Also die
Germans
Deutschen
married
haben
off their
ihre
royal and noble
ihre
daughters to
Königs-
Russians.
und
There
Herzogstücher
were
haben die
German generals who served in
Russen
Russia,
verheiratet.
and
Sie
plenty of
hatten
German
solche Generäle, die
scientists
bei
as
den
well.
Russen
And there are lots of
Militärten
German
Wissenschaftler
words
en
in the
masse.
Russian
Man muss sich
vocabulary.
immer es gibt viele deutsche Wörter im russischen
Marschrutka,
For example, a marshrutka.
Marschrutka. Also,
Marshrutka. So if you go to any university in Russia, visit their museum, you'll always find a German who once taught there. And I mean, we've really reached a kind of barbarism where all those good beginnings are just gone. People don't even remember them anymore. Nobody cares. The Goethe Institute is gone. There's no one left organizing cultural exchange, no youth exchange programs, nothing. Everything is being done to make sure people don't meet each other anymore. And that's what leads to disaster. It's clearly deliberate. They want us not to know the Russians at all. That way, it's easier to kill them. That's how I see it.
So sehe ich das.
Wenn man sich überlegt, was da am Rande
When you think about everything that could happen on the edge of a nuclear inferno,
kann.
would you say the current political elite in Germany is simply blind to the apocalypse, or are they actually necrophilic, addicted to death?
Oder ist sie gar nekrophil, todessehnsüchtig?
Ui. Tja,
Well,
also ich meine,
yeah. I mean, these are definitely people who are missing the most important feeling a human being needs: love.
Liebe.
Someone who truly
Seine
loves
Familie, seinen Freunden,
their family,
Bekannten,
their
Leute, die
friends,
in Not sind.
even strangers on the street who are in need.
Das ist denen irgendwie-
Someone who helps and
das
loves
gefällt ihnen
them.
nicht. Und,
That normal human feeling just doesn't exist for them. I mean, this Western culture, the Russians made fun of that Olympic show in Paris, and to them it already seemed to be heading in that direction.
Das war, glaub ich,
Hm?
das kam ihnen irgendwie sehr, also schon in diese Richtung vor. Also Untergangskultur irgendwie, eine Kultur sich. Die
It's
sich
kind of a
nicht,
culture of
nicht
decline,
mehr an
a
Menschen orientiert,
culture
sondern
that's no
irgendwie
longer centered on
extrem,
people, but somehow on these extreme longings for death, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, nothing. Look, in Russian art, the human being is always there. You always see the person in a Russian painting, and I'm not at all against abstract art or anything like that. I even have a print by an artist like that hanging in my apartment. But this reduction of art down to pure abstraction and this sort of technical, mechanized approach, I see that as a real danger.
Ja, dieses Technisierte, das ist doch, sehe ich auch als Gefahr. Also
The struggle, I'd say, in a society where everything starts to shake, where jobs are getting scarcer, where young people don't know what their future will look like. This struggle, even just to survive, is actually harmful to normal human development. When the state keeps pulling back from providing basic things like housing, healthcare, and so on, and people are basically left on their own, they start behaving, so to speak, like animals in the jungle, turning on each other. That's what happens when the state, as the basic provider that sets the framework, disappears. Then chaos takes over, and at some point, you end up with people who don't have a job, and they say, well, then I'll just go to war.
Weil sie keinen Job haben, ja, dann gehe ich eben in den Krieg, ne? Und also die Großen kenne ich ja gar nicht, da schieße ich einfach drauf. Das sind doch die
I don't even know the big ones. I just shoot at them. They're the bad guys, right? I mean, these are the kinds of things I don't want to give a final judgment here because what I'm saying is really spontaneous. But those are the thoughts I have about it. What really surprises me, for example, is that the way soldiers in Ukraine are being forced into buses on the street with violence doesn't cause an outcry in Germany, that the German media don't report on it. I find that, for instance, there are a few exceptions. Die Welt sometimes does cover it.
Einige Ausnahmen, also die Welt bringt manchmal da was drüber, aber das droht doch den deutschen Jugendlichen auch. Also die
That same thing could happen to young people in Germany, too. Those paid territorial units in Ukraine probably get a pile of money for every man they grab off the street. They beat him, rough him up so badly, he ends up in the hospital, throw him on a bus, and send him straight to the front. The whole internet is full of videos showing that. But where's the reaction in Germany? Is that really the path to Europe, to our civilization? Or is it actually the other way around, that with the help of the US and Ukraine, a civil war, a coup on the Maidan, was organized?
ein Machtputsch, also auf dem Maidan organisiert wurde.
2014.
Und jetzt haben wir praktisch ein schwarzes Loch.
And now we practically have a complete black hole there, from which all kinds of threats are coming. Weapons are being smuggled into Europe. Children are being, the Russians will say that, and I can't prove it, but Ukraine has become something like a laboratory. It actually started before the Maidan, when surrogacy there became normal. So basically, the production of children, baby production, for people from wealthy countries. And now there's this rumor. The Russians say, and I've seen it myself in some films, that there's an organization called White Angels that's carrying out forced evacuations of families from eastern Ukrainian regions, where more of the Russian-speaking population lives.
Wo also mehr die russischsprachige Bevölkerung lebt. Oder ja. Und dann kommen die also mit Maschinenpistolen.
So they show up with submachine guns, stand in front of the house, and say, "You have to come with us now." Or they go down into the basement, armed. I mean, what civilian would say, "No, I'm not doing that"? In Donetsk, I met a family that had fled from Pokrovsk. They'd been hiding for a long time, maybe not quite 2 years, in basements in Pokrovsk, because they suspected those so-called White Angels were coming. That's a Ukrainian paramilitary unit that supposedly evacuates children toward the west. And then they managed to get out, Denis, his mother, and his father, and they made it to Donetsk, with help from Russian aid organizations.
Mit Hilfe auch von russischen Hilfsorganisationen. Ich habe diesen Denis, haben wir den getroffen in einer Wohnung am Rand.
We met this boy, Denis, in an apartment on the outskirts of Donetsk around New Year's. There was a small gift event organized by a local aid group from the Donetsk side. They gave the boy some sports clothes, shoes, and other things he didn't have. Then someone asked me, "Would you like to play Santa Claus for this event?" So I did. Next to me was a journalist from Belarus who played Snegoroshka, the snow maiden. At the end of January, we brought the gifts to the boy. And honestly, it was a really nice feeling. Seeing his face, seeing how happy he was, that was a very special moment.
Sein Gesicht zu sehen und seine Freude zu sehen, das war ein sehr schönes Gefühl. Also
Das alles sind Erlebnisse, die
All of that comes from experiences you had in the war zone.
Man kann dies sogar im Internet.
You can actually find this online. You can see it when you read your books, your articles, or even my books. But people don't do it. Is the German public sleepwalking into its own downfall?
Bevölkerung in den Untergang.
ja, ich frage mich auch, was die Leute
Yeah, I also wonder what's actually keeping people from, waking up.
aufzuwachen.
It seems like this attitude has been trained into us for many years, maybe even for decades. You know, the authorities tell us what to do, and the newspapers tell the truth. Back in earlier times, when there wasn't a threat of war, that wasn't so dangerous. But now this obedience, this submissive mindset, has become life-threatening. And what's really troubling is that the generation I belong to, the one from the ecology movement, the women's movement, the anti-fascist movement, the generation of '68, that generation has practically fallen silent. Many of them are even with the Green Party now, and they've become the ones who are in fact the loudest in calling for weapons to be sent to Ukraine.
Geworden, die am schärfsten sozusagen sogar Waffen für die Ukraine fordern. Und also das ist
Honestly, I'm speechless about this. I mean, just how deep anti-Russian sentiment runs in Germany, how deeply it's rooted. Of course, back in the 60s during the student movement, only a small part of that generation was really pro-Russian. Most of them were anti-authoritarian. They just wanted to break away from the reactionary conservative way of life that dominated Germany up until the late 60s. They wanted peace, but that rebellious spirit you find in Italy, in France, in Spain, somehow, in Germany, it's missing. There just doesn't seem to be any real ground for it, even though we have such wonderful writers, Goethe, Heinrich Heine, and Rilke.
Heinrich Heine, und Rilke, also Leute, die scharfsinnig waren, die mit Humor
People who were sharp-minded, who used humor to stand up to those in power. But somehow that feels too weak now. And I think, of course we don't know for sure, but I'm convinced that those in power, especially the military, NATO, and these big corporations, are probably pulling the strings behind the scenes, steering things the way they want. I mean, we're in a crisis situation. Capitalism itself is in crisis. And in this crisis, it looks to me like the military and the big industrial players are trying to solve it through a war against Russia. That's how it seems to me.
einen Krieg gegen Russland. So kommt es mir vor, ne?
Aber warum
But why are the lambs in Germany silent, the ones being driven to the slaughterhouse of war?
Bank des Krieges getrieben werden sollen?
Ich glaube, die Menschen betrügen
I think people are kind of fooling themselves. They tell themselves, oh, it won't be that bad, or there's nothing I can do, or everyone else is doing it anyway. It's this sort of herd instinct. It starts with small things. For example, I come to Germany, I visit a friend, and the very first thing at the doorstep is some kind of joke about Putin. And if you don't laugh along, then it's like, oh, he's not laughing, he's not one of us, so to speak. I mean, this kind of thing, in Germany, I think people are actually quite strict about that.
irgendwie, finde ich. Also
Mein Freund, der Krieg
My friend, the war reporter Kolja Spurry from Munich says, and he even writes this in a book, that Germans are the most brainwashed people in the world. Is that true?
der Welt. Stimmt das?
ja, da ist wohl was dran.
Yeah,
Das hängt,
there's
glaub ich,
probably
damit
something to
zusammen
that.
mit der
I think it also has to do with how deeply our daily lives are intertwined with technology. And it was already like that under the Nazis. I mean, there was fascism in other countries too, but in no other country was it carried out so perfectly, so systematically, with concentration camps where Jewish people had their heads shaved and their gold teeth taken out. Russian prisoners of war were all disinfected before being sent out to the fields, where they had to live without any shelter. Every single one of them had a card made, noting exactly when they were arrested, where they came from, and what their name was. You can actually find all those cards online today.
Wie heißt. Diese Karten kann man heute im Internet alle finden. Ich meine, die Deutschen sind doch die, sag ich mal, die
I mean, the Germans are, let's say, real fanatics for order.
wie man sie
Textbook examples, really. And of course, you know, a highly developed capitalist system works great as long as it's not in crisis. Then the whole world looks at Germany, perfectly organized, amazing technology, excellent engineering education. Everyone wants to copy Germany, from the Chinese to, well, whoever else. But the moment this huge industrial complex runs into a crisis, that same perfectionism, which is a core element of industrial society, can flip into something inhuman. Hopefully it won't come to that, but it could turn into a development where the human side just disappears.
das Menschliche einfach nicht mehr drin vorkommt. Ne?
Du sagst, der Kapitalismus ist in der Krise. Und
You say capitalism is in crisis.
für fast alle
And in fact, for almost all Western industrial nations, you can statistically show that the profit rate, the ratio of invested capital to profits, is falling. And when that happens, the capital side gets nervous. Is that one of the reasons for the war in Ukraine, for NATO pushing all the way to the Russian border?
Vordringen der NATO bis an die russische Grenze?
Ja, also das ist meiner Ansicht nach
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. There's really no other way to explain this willingness to die, this insane focus on war, on the so-called Operations Plan Germany, with the military on the streets, inside the country. It's secret. This Operations Plan Germany isn't even fully public. It's being kept under wraps. That's straight out of George Orwell. The worst things you could only read about in those futuristic novels are actually happening now. I mean, who really holds power in Germany? It's not the ordinary people who go to work, build cars, care for children, or teach them. It's the people who look at their consulting contracts, who think about how to climb the ladder in the world of banks and corporations.
Konzernwelt, das sind, glaube ich, ganz andere Wertvorstellungen. Also das ist nicht das Miteinander einer Gesellschaft, wo man also am Gemeinwohl interessiert ist, wo man praktisch sich freut, wenn der andere, den man vielleicht gar nicht kennt, dass es dem auch mal gut geht, sondern man guckt dann eben nur auf die eigene Firma, auf die eigene, auf den eigenen, was man angelegt hat an Wertpapieren, wie sich das entwickelt. Wenn das ich meine, ich habe das sowieso schon gemerkt in den letzten 20 Jahren, also dass man uns vormachen wollte, wir können.
And that somehow it turned into a kind of sport.
Und es wurde sozusagen zum Sport und so. Also völlig albern. Also jetzt ist praktisch
Completely ridiculous. Now we're facing the fact that everything's falling apart, and all those financial models that supposedly make everyone a millionaire, none of them hold up. Because no one owns as much property as, for example, the heirs in West Germany. In East Germany, they simply don't exist. There are no industrial dynasties in the East either. Those only exist in the West. So, I mean, there's so much injustice in this country, that's something we really ought to deal with. Fixing these imbalances within Germany itself, that would be an important task.
Also zu beheben, das wäre eine Aufgabe, die wichtig wäre. Aber diese Aufgaben, diese Industriebau.
But these tasks, these industrial barons and military leaders, that's not what they're aiming for. That's not what's on their minds. And I think that really has something to do with the fact that they're basically walking around with the mindset of their fathers, the ones who came out of World War II. Back then, the Americans said, "All right, you were Nazis, but we're not going to hassle you for long. Go rebuild the economy. But you have to be anti-communist. You can't team up with the Russians." So Germany had to be divided. A united Germany, they said, would only end up as a Russian colony.
Könnte ja nur eine russische Kolonie werden. Also damals sind ja die Deutschen unsere Väter,
That's what Germans, our fathers, our grandmothers and grandfathers, grew up with. And the people in positions of responsibility, in Germany, in politics, in business, well, I saw it myself with my father. He was an entrepreneur, and he was an enthusiastic military man right up until he died. He never regretted having been in the Soviet Union, never regretted fighting there. He claimed the Russians were planning to attack us. That was the official version, and it was even echoed in discussions in the Frankfurter Allgemeine, the idea that the Russians actually wanted to attack us. And with that, any discussion about the crimes of that time was basically no longer necessary.
Und
Gibt es psychologisch
Is there, psychologically speaking, a kind of reversal of guilt in Germany? One that turns the victims of World War II into the real perpetrators, the way you just described it in relation to your father?
für deinen Vater beschrieben hast?
ja, also man muss, also das liegt sehr nah.
Yeah, I mean, that thought really comes naturally. I have to say, it's hard for me, on a human level, to truly believe it. I was raised Christian, for example, but I left the church when I was 18. I realized my parents didn't want to answer a lot of questions, like what happened on the Eastern Front, what happened to the Jews, and so on, and they also had very anti-Jewish attitudes. That all felt strange to me. I mean, how can someone call themselves a Christian if they stay silent about the Vietnam War, and if they don't want to talk about their own German history, about the crimes that were committed? I really don't know.
Also, ich weiß auch nicht, also
Wenn der Kapitalismus, wie du sagst, expansiv ist,
If capitalism, as you say, is expansionist, always chasing new profits to pay off old debts, If the current political generation in the West is both Russophobic and racist, and at the same time the public is asleep, then how do we get out of this situation?
Wie kommen wir aus dieser Situation wieder heraus?
Ja, meiner Ansicht nach müssen wir
Well, I mean, basically, we have to do everything we can to make sure we don't become like the big crowd, so to speak. That means we just have to do our work as journalists the way we know how. We need to connect with people all over the world, whether they live in Russia or in the United States. We need to create forums where we can talk about peace, about how to preserve it, and we really have to avoid any kind of sectarianism. No pointless, exhausting arguments between different organizations. That's just meaningless. And of course, those in power keep pushing us into exactly that, into turning on each other, even within the peace movement and among left-wing and progressive groups.
linken und fortschrittlichen Kräften, dass wir uns gegenseitig fertig machen. Da reiben die sich dann die Hände. Wir müssen praktisch klug sein und müssen.
That's when they start rubbing their hands together. We have to be smart about this, practical and strategic, and we need to focus on what really matters. And what matters is raising awareness, through articles, through films, through public discussions, about this danger of war and the warlike mindset of our elite. I also hope that other nations might support us, maybe in Cuba, or who knows, in China. There are countries that might sympathize with us. And maybe there are new ways for us to connect internationally and support each other.
Dass wir auf internationaler Ebene uns vernetzen und uns gegenseitig unterstützen.
Es gibt ja auch Modelle des Regierungshandelns.
There are also examples of how governments can act, like in Spain, for instance. Their government denied the Americans overflight rights because Spain didn't want to take part in supporting the attack on Iran. The German government could take a page from that. So why don't they?
Könnte man sich ja ein Beispiel nehmen als Bundesregierung. Warum tun die das nicht?
Ja, das ist wirklich unvorstellbar. Also, ich meine, erst reden
That's really unbelievable. I mean, first they talk about Europe and the European family and how everyone's equal. But the truth is, Germany, because of its economic power and its position right in the center of Europe, just takes all kinds of liberties. And I'm talking about the German leadership here, not ordinary Germans. They take liberties and simply dismiss approaches like the one from Spain, laugh them off, and don't even bother to respond. I mean, that's such bad manners, such arrogance. It's just outrageous.
Das ist einfach abstoßend. Also ich meine, warum kann man nicht.
I mean, why can't all the European countries, the whole European family, like the Visegrad Group, Slovakia, Spain, and others, why can't they just sit down and talk about these things in a normal, brotherly way, so to speak? It's really strange, and it's extremely odd that we first go and create Europe, build a common currency, and then in practice, end up making the main decisions in a small circle. Germany, France, maybe the Netherlands, or Norway. Everyone else isn't really included, not treated as full partners, not taken seriously. I mean, the worst example was during the Greek crisis, when the German finance minister tried to tell the Greeks how they should manage their budget.
Vorschreiben wollte, wie sie ihren Haushalt machen sollen. Also,
Am Ende
In the end, Greek pensions were cut to save German banks.
Banken zu retten.
ja. Also, ich meine,
Well, I mean,
das ist auch so eine
Greece is also one of those countries that suffered under German fascism. And I think many Germans have already forgotten that, mostly because they were never really informed about it. It's not just about the Soviet Union, it's also about the German occupation in Italy, Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria. I mean, what do people actually know about that? Practically nothing. It's this kind of master race attitude. Many Germans might not even be aware of it, but that's really where it all begins.
Es geht doch damit los. Ich war irgendwann vor 30 Jahren in Süditalien.
About 30 years ago, I was in southern Italy. I've always been a real fan of Italy. And down there, I had a conversation with some Italian guys, a bit younger than I was at the time. That's when it really hit me. These guys come from a poor region of Italy. They can't even afford to travel to northern Italy. And here I am, able to travel all over Europe, even spending my vacation time in southern Italy. That's a huge imbalance, real inequality within Europe itself. And that's something that's never really been properly discussed. So yeah.
Debattiert und also
Die deutsche Bundesregierung ist ja auch
The German federal government has also taken the initiative to steal, to seize, more than 200 billion euros of Russian foreign assets, which are mainly held at Euroclear in Brussels, and hand them over to Ukraine so it can buy weapons in Europe. Is the government pushing Europe back into a kind of highway robbery?
Den Rückfall Europas ins Straßenräubertum.
ja, so muss man das wohl sagen. Also
Yeah, that's probably the right way to put it.
ich meine, die belgische Regierung
I mean, as far as I know, the Belgian government actually tried to stop it because they were realistic enough to realize that if you just go and seize assets like that, the whole financial system could grind to a halt. And of course, it has consequences. Basically, German companies that still do business in Russia, or cases where Russia still owes payments to Germany, those transactions aren't happening anymore. Because the thinking is, well, the Europeans, the Germans, took everything from us anyway, so why should we still pay any compensation or anything like that?
Haben uns ja alles geklaut, was sollen wir denn noch an Entschädigung zahlen oder so? Oder ich meine, das ist ein Räubertum.
I mean, that's basically robbery. And it's really quite strange that the Germans, who are usually so focused on order, who see themselves as well-mannered and working at the highest scientific level, would resort to methods like that. By doing so, they're undermining their entire self-image, the idea that Germany is a scientifically, technologically, and intellectually advanced country. That whole picture just collapses. And of course, Germany won't come through this unscathed.
Nicht unbeschadet überstehen. Also
Bleibt die Bevölkerung in Deutschland vielleicht deswegen so ruhig?
Is the population in Germany maybe staying so calm because they feel that the West's plundering still leaves them with a small share of the spoils?
Selbst noch mit einem kleinen Obolus davonkommen?
ja, das ist naheliegend, dieser Gedanke.
Yeah, that thought makes sense. I mean, it's already starting. Ukrainian and German defense companies are basically working together, making plans for production.
Rüstungsfirmen gemeinsam Pläne machen für Produktion.
Creates jobs.
Und da wird doch sicherlich
And there will surely be plenty of drone experts, young, high-tech people who really know their stuff in that field. They'll probably get funding, and suddenly they're at the front in Ukraine, working there. And
tätig, ne? Also, und
Wenn die Ukraine aus
When Ukraine is bled dry and it's already suffered enormous losses, will we then hear again, like during the Boxer Rebellion in China back in 1900, send the Germans to the front?
1900, die Deutschen an die Front?
ja, also darauf deutet doch alles hin, denke ich mal. Also das
yeah,
ist ja,
everything seems to point in that direction, I'd say. I mean, it's just, I keep waiting for the moment when the Ukrainian generals say, we can't go on. But they'll probably never say that. And instead what'll happen is that at some point, the Germans or other European countries will send their soldiers. That's pretty obvious. Because, I mean, European politicians, Germany first and foremost, haven't missed a single month since 2022, especially without showing their presence in Ukraine.
Monat ausgelassen, dass sie nicht Präsenz gezeigt haben in der Ukraine. Und immer wieder haben sie also Habeck und wer nicht alles in der Ukraine.
And time and again, they've gone there, Habeck and all the others who've been to Ukraine. So now they're saying, we're setting up industrial sites and so on, even though the war was already raging. But where exactly are you supposed to build an industrial site in that situation? It's completely unrealistic. I mean, Russia is deliberately bombing all kinds of factories where weapons are made or stored. So normal production just isn't possible anymore. Although I have to say, I was just in Kyrgyzstan, and there I actually bought cookies. Roshan cookies, you know, from that oligarch, what's his name, Poroshenko.
Also Roshan Kekse.
Der Schokolade.
They called him the Chocolate King.
Und das heißt, meine Frau sagte, eine Russin sagte.
So my wife said, a Russian woman told her, it doesn't seem all that bad in Ukraine if they can still make and export cookies. I mean, of course, simple images like that never really tell you much. That's why I've always been skeptical at least instinctively, when some people in the debate said Ukraine has already lost the war. I mean, there's some truth to that, sure. But as long as the Russian army keeps advancing, even if it's just 6 miles a day, there's really no end in sight.
Vielleicht geht es gerade darum,
Maybe the whole point is to trigger an endless war, so to speak, to keep pressure on the Russian Federation from the West, from the European side, so that the Americans can turn their attention to other adversaries.
sich anderen Konfliktgegnern zuwenden können.
Auf jeden Fall. Also, ich meine,
Absolutely. I mean, this kind of warfare, anyone who's looked into the war in Ukraine can see that practically nothing is really working anymore. Even Ukrainian media and observers themselves are writing that they're short on personnel and discipline is breaking down. By the way, in Donetsk, I actually met 3 Ukrainian soldiers who are now fighting on the Russian side. So that happens too. And honestly, any normal military expert would have to admit this is a strange kind of war. It doesn't really follow any clear logic. And above all, the most important thing, the preservation of one's own forces, the soldiers and the equipment that's being pushed to the extreme.
Das geht ja ins Unermessliche. Also die Zahlen, was die Russen vorlegen, was sie schon an
The numbers the Russians are putting out about how much Western equipment they've already destroyed are just unbelievable. Most of the Western tanks have already been wiped out, and yet more keeps getting delivered, and money keeps flowing. But the most important thing is the soldiers. I mean, you just have to look at those videos showing what happens when men are grabbed off the street. Then you see women, of all ages, from young women in their 20s to grandmothers, clinging to those Ukrainian captors, trying to stop them from taking their husbands and grandfathers away.
Wir befinden uns eigentlich in der Ukraine in einer Phase wie Deutschland.
I mean, Ukraine is basically in a phase like Germany was in April 1945, when 70-year-olds and 16-year-olds were being sent to the front. That's exactly the situation Ukraine is in right now. And what could happen next is really only one of 2 things. Either foreign intervention by Western forces, Germans and others, or uprisings inside Ukraine, where soldiers or officers join together and say, we're overthrowing this government.
Sich zusammenschließen und sagen, wir stürzen diese Regierung.
Ist dieser Krieg in der Ukraine
Is this war in Ukraine basically a large-scale money laundering machine meant to pull money out of citizens' pockets and wash it through a sea of blood into the hands of multimillionaires, billionaires, and the financial industry?
der Finanzindustrie zu spülen?
Ja, das kann man so sagen. Aber ich meine,
Yes, you could put it that way. I mean, factually, that's how it is. But of course, it's not just about enriching the arms company Rheinmetall. There's a whole concept of territorial gain behind it. I believe that the EU elites, Germany first and foremost, want Ukraine itself, as territory, as a market, as a country. That's the first goal. The second is to keep constant pressure on Russia, to keep things simmering. When they couldn't achieve anything with Navalny or other opposition figures they heavily supported, when they couldn't get Chechnya to break away, and when the dream of Russia splitting into different republics didn't come true, they turned to a different tactic, keeping up continuous pressure along the Russian border.
erreichen konnte, dann versucht man es eben mit einem Dauerfeuer an der russischen Grenze. Und ich meine, natürlich können die westlichen
And I mean, of course, the Western elites, they have advisors too. And they know that in Russia, for example, there are oligarchs who probably aren't too thrilled about a long war. After all, they came up in a time when you could make good money from oil and gas exports. So for them, this is tough. They have to completely reorient themselves, and some have even left the country. And I mean, that's exactly the kind of conflict the Western elite is counting on. They're watching very closely. Where are the fault lines within the Russian leadership, the possible weak spots? How can they drive a wedge in there?
Wie kann man da einen Spaltpilz fördern? Und ich meine, Putin hat jetzt gerade gesagt, also wird.
And I mean, Putin just said he's warning against using the Duma election in September to divide Russian society. I mean, that's an unusual warning. Under normal circumstances, I'd almost consider it not entirely appropriate, because it creates a sense of uncertainty. But under wartime conditions, it's also understandable. After all, any statesman who doesn't fight during a war, and who doesn't keep an eye on that wedge the West keeps deliberately driving in, would be failing his own people.
Du lebst seit vielen Jahren in Moskau und manchmal
You've been living in Moscow for many years, and sometimes an observer on the sidelines, at the periphery, sees things more sharply and can assess them more precisely from a distance. As someone watching from afar, what advice would you give to people in Germany?
Dass sie einfach
That they should just be honest with themselves, that they should allow their human feelings, that as human beings, they should give space to their longing for peace, that they should allow that, and not let themselves be switched over into a longing for war.
in eine Kriegssehnsucht umpolen lassen.
sagt der Kriegsreporter Ulrich.
That's what war correspondent Ulrich Heyden says, who's been living in Moscow for many years. People shouldn't let themselves be driven into new wars, because all wars are wars of the banks, of capitalism. Capital is always looking for expansion and new profits, even if it means stepping over dead bodies. Thank you for that. Here at Against the Current, we show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden. Stay with us.
Propagandamedien verschweigen. Bleiben Sie dabei.